Hey, what's up, URM? How are you doing today? I have legendary mastering engineer Maor Appelbaum on me with today. Maor, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me on the show, on the Q&A show, whatever it's called, live stream, whatever.
The pleasure is all ours. So today we're going to be doing a live Q&A. So if you're coming into this chat now, please put a little bracket and the Q section, and we'll make sure that we get your question asked here. We're going to be talking about mastering. And if you're not familiar with Maor, I'll do the pleasure of hyping you up here so you don't have to do it yourself. But Maor is, I believe you have sold tens and tens of millions of records as a mastering engineer that you've worked on. You've worked with some of the biggest producers in the entire world, just some absolute icons, everybody from massive artists all the way down to small artists. And what I've always liked about chatting with you, Maor, as we're good friends, is that we go really, really deep into audio and get super nerdy on stuff that I feel like it's rare that you're ever going to find information like that out in the public. You know what I mean? So for me, I always get excited because we go down some really awesome rabbit holes because you have such great access to so many just massive people who have had such a massive impact in music as producers, as mixers, etc. And you've seen and worked with so many different people. I think you draw from such a broad perspective of people and experience and knowledge, and you've got a lot of great things to share. So I'm excited to have you here. I hope you're ready to be drilled with questions.
Drilling is all about having fun.
All right. So I'm going to start out here. I've got some questions that they've already asked here in the chat, but I'm going to start out with one of my own. And if anybody here who follows me on Instagram knows, I've been posting and talking about different levels of mixing. And what I mean by different levels of mixing is like, I kind of think about mixing like a video game. So I'm going to preface this a little bit before I ask you the actual question. And, the problem with the game is like, if you're playing and you think the game ends at level 20, right? You get to level 20, it unlocks. Now it goes to 30. Now you're playing with level 30 players. You're a beginner again. Then it unlocks to 50, then 90. And the game keeps going. It's a perpetual game. And given that you've worked with people from all levels of the game, right? And I think my question for you is, the perspective and the mentality that you have, like when you're a major producer who sold tens of millions of records and made iconic things that are timeless, there's a certain way you think. And, if you're somebody that's just starting out and maybe you've been mixing, say 3 years, there's a certain way you think and a certain set of viewpoints that you might have and things like that. So I would ask, from a mastering perspective, what do you think is the difference, right? So if you could maybe bridge people, help bridge the gap from like the way the biggest people that are the most iconic think and what's important to them. And so we can share that with people that are below that are looking upwards and saying, someday I want to be that. What advice could you share and direction could you maybe give us?
Well, first of all, thank you for asking that question, because I think that's one of those questions that are not asked in most of the times. And I think also it's because the answer is quite complicated. But when you're talking about levels, okay, so levels could be just like there's subgenres of music, okay? Like there's rock, there's hard rock, there's prog rock, there's indie rock, right? Folk rock, soft rock, same with metal, heavy metal, death metal, brutal metal, doom metal, contemporary metal, whatever, progressive metal. Levels of mixing is also more of like different aesthetics, different approaches, okay? You might have a very big mixer do something and you'll say, why did he choose that direction? Well, that's the aesthetic he went with. So anytime you're progressing with your skills, it doesn't mean it ends there. There's, like you said, you get to a certain level and then you think you got it, and then you're like, oh, but there's even more, and there's even more, and there's also even less. So what happens is it's a moving target, because the aesthetics are dictated by the trends. They're dictated by the type of music that now is being worked on. For example, if you take a lot of the music in the 80s, a lot of it was done to a super pristine level, which is maybe unreached in some cases today. In some cases, not all of them, okay? Because records are done differently. Okay, so it doesn't mean you don't have the tools and the ability to get to those sounds. A lot of times it just means that's not how the records are done today. Okay, same thing, if you're trying to get a 70s sound and you're not getting it, it's not because you're not good, it's because the records are not done that way today. The tools are different, the approaches are different, and to go back in time requires a different mindset. So levels are basically how you accomplish it, but also how does that fit with what's now needed. I do a lot of legacy bands, and legacy bands have a sound that people expect them. For example, I work with Yes and Faith No More and Meatloaf and other bands like that. They have a sound that people expect to hear with that type of sound and aesthetic. If you bring them something totally new to the table, it's like, oh, the band changed their sound or changed their approach, which can be cool, but sometimes the audience is looking for that. Now, on the other hand, I also do a lot of contemporary bands. Okay, I've worked with bands like Starset, and I've done bands like Sepultura, and I've done, other bands, and Dream Theater, and there's a bunch of them. But the point is that any type of mixing level or production level is always in comparison to where the artistic vision is aiming for, where the mixer's aesthetic is, and also the audience. Okay, if you're making a contemporary record and you want it to sound hip like today, you're probably not going to go lo-fi, or you're probably not going to go on like a legacy sound. Okay, and the big mixers of each era are big at that era or a few eras because they honed the craft of being contemporary with their sound. And that's why you take the big names that are relevant today and you aim for that. A few years from now, if they're still doing this and they're a contemporary, then that's the next aim is to be like where they're going. There's legacy and legendary mixers that done records that sold 20 million, 30 million, whatever million, 10 million, 15 million. And they were super successful and sounded amazing, but not everybody's aiming for that sound today. So it's all a matter of perspective. And the more you go in, the more you find that the levels are going up. The more you aim for a high target, that target doesn't just stay there. It can move based on what's coming up. So if you let's say you like what a certain producer is doing or mixer, and now they're upping their game, now that target that you were aiming towards originally, that's an old target. Now they up their game, and now you got to up your game. And there's also mixers that their game from the get-go, and I'm not saying when they started, but from the get-go, from like their successful hits, that target is so far out of reach that everybody's trying to aim there. And guess what? They can't. Why? Because mixed decisions are not made technically. They made by artistic choices and taste. So even if you're going to learn now how this guy does his drums, this bass, it's not going to be his choices. It's not going to sound like him. It's going to sound like an inspiration, just like if someone writes a song inspired by a different artist. It's not going to have the same feel. Okay. It might have like, oh, they like that band. Okay. So those levels are moving targets or stationary targets, but when they're stationary, they're legendary. When they're moving targets, they can still be legendary, but they're aiming at different places. And I'll give you another point of view. When someone says, I'm doing a modern sound, and they're kind of copying a sound of someone who is current and has some songs out on the radio, that sound is already done, which means in a few months from now, another sound is coming out. Or by the time that song is out on the radio, they've already achieved something else. So the chase is on. Okay. And that also applies not just in mixing, it applies in production, in arrangement, songwriting, tracking even, because some people track in different ways and they learn different techniques. And it's applied also in mastering. So that level thing you're talking about, there's so many levels. It's not like 1, 2, 3, and that's the aim. We're looking at 1,000,000. There's 1,000,000 ways to mix, and maybe 1,000 of them are amazing, and maybe 500 of them are groundbreaking, and maybe 2 are earth-shattering, whatever. You know what I mean? It's like, it doesn't end. And that's why a lot of the producers will tell you, they're learning new things all the time, or they're experiencing things now that are different than before. And it could be a technology change, like gear and working with different aspects of the music and the technology incorporated to it, or a new type of music coming their way. Evolution. But we also have to remember with us progressing, there's a big degradation as well. It's not like everything is going up. There's a bunch of going down, and quality doesn't always go up. Some of it goes down. Ability of musicians maybe goes up in one way, but guess what? They're relying on other stuff. So maybe there's other elements that are not as equal. So we always have to remember that we're not getting onwards and forwards and whatever you call it all the time. We're going backwards in certain things. So there's a kind of equilibrium.
So if you had to give somebody that's aspiring one day to be at the top of the game some advice, maybe they've been, I don't want to say in the beginning of their career, but somebody who's kind of starting to get going, they've been doing this for a couple of years. They've been hanging out, watching some Nail the Mixes, learning. They've got some clientele, and you're watching this right now, right? From that point of view, what advice would you give that person to somebody who, say, wants to aspire to be like a CLA level good or something like that? You know what I mean? Is there like any specific things they should focus on, or anything philosophical that you would recommend they pay attention to?
First thing I would suggest is try to understand the impact of the music. It's a very hard thing to understand because it's very easy to get fooled by volume, easy to get fooled by image, by clout or stuff like that. My suggestion is go to a lot of shows, see how a band is reacting on stage. Okay, studio environment is a factory in a way. You can take things and maneuver them. Okay, now there are live recordings. There are situations where in a studio you can actually capture a real performance, and that's been done on a ton of records. And there's a lot of examples of great bands going in the studio and just recording live, or most of their tracks live. But going to a show and seeing the interaction between musicians on stage and seeing when they're hitting it right, when it's not right, those things teach you on how music is coming out, because you're not going to see everything 100% good. You're probably going to see a lower percentage like that. And even if a band is amazing on stage, you'll learn from that a lot. And you see how the audience reacts. So I think live performances are very important to learn from. Another thing is, don't try to immerse yourself too much with music without understanding what you're actually feeding yourself. And the reason I'm saying this, it's tricky, is there's a music that you like. There's music that you like what it has, like sonic imprint, production, okay? And there's music that you don't like, but you want to learn from it, okay? Now, if you want to learn from the music, you don't just need to listen to it as like a enjoyment factor. You need to learn to listen it from another perspective of educational, okay, because you're aiming for a profession in it. Now, when you listen to it educational, try to not listen to the music and get immersed by it, but more try to listen to it from a painting standpoint, like an artistic standpoint, like a critic in a museum. Okay, you're looking at a picture. What are you seeing in the picture? Okay, if you immerse yourself all the time with the music, which is what the fans are doing, that's their job, to get immersed by the music. Us as professionals, we need to get immersed by the music because we love music, but we also need to look at music as canvas. Okay, we need to look at it as how the colors are connected, how the shades are, the images, okay, the words. I just said a Dream Theater record, images and words.
Good.
So if you do that, it's going to just make you more magnified to the inner important things. And yes, music is first, but there's a lot of things that surround the music that help the music come out to you. And I think for beginners, intermediates, and experts, that's like the best advice. But for the beginners, this is the best advice, because if they start early with that, then any course they'll take or any tips they learn down the road, it will all connect to that. They will all connect to the point of, oh, that's why you did that effect on the vocals. That's why the guitars are like panned this way, or this is why the bass is important to sit right. You know, it all comes down to how you perceive things and look at them. I hope that this answer was good.
Oh, it's phenomenal. I hope they can take that all in, because there's a lot of really great nuggets in that to really sit down and digest and think about. Okay, so I've got a ton of questions here that have come in. And by the way, if you're new coming in here, just put a Q in a bracket and we'll get to your question here. And
Joel, did I cover the levels of mixing well, or you need?
I thought you did great. Yeah, no,
okay.
You did phenomenal. Very interesting answer. There's some really good nuggets in there. Okay, so here's a great question. You and I talk about this all the time because we're both gear nerds and we love gear. What is the difference between analog mastering and mastering in the box?
Okay, so let's start by dividing it not to analog mastering, but more hardware mastering and plugin and software mastering, okay? Because hardware can cover also digital, okay? Also, when we're doing analog mastering, let's face it, we're using also digital equipment. A converter is a digital and analog conversion, so it's equipment. So I'll start with saying there's no difference in terms of its tools, and then I will complete that with saying there's a big difference. And so let's start with this. Analog or hardware mastering versus plugin mastering. Both of those things are basically tools in your disposal. In hardware and in software, we have EQs, limiters, compressors, de-essers, saturators, noise reduction options, what else? Stereo enhancements. I don't know. You could put
There's
effects on. We have all of that. So basically, you can approach either hardware or software and have all these tools at your disposal. Back in the day, the software was more limited to what it had to offer. And in time, they had more and more and more, because they developed more plugins that became better and better. And today's plugins are actually amazing compared to what you had 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, to the point where you can get great results with them. Now, I'm going to move now to the hardware. A hardware is a choice, okay? Some people will say they don't want hardware anymore. They don't want to deal with that. They don't want to do recalls. They don't want to deal with cables and different pieces of gear and all that. And they go only for software, which is plugins and the DAW. Other people like the hardware. Same with mixers. Some mixing engineers love hardware, and that's their bread and butter of the mixing, dealing with the hardware and pushing it to the directions they want. Now, of course, it's always the ears and the mind and the taste and the production values and the ideas and aesthetics, but you choose where to go to with it. In my case, I prefer working with hardware, and the reasoning behind that is because I have both hardware and software, and I could choose which one I prefer to. So it's not lack of hardware, I go choose software, or lack of software, I use hardware. I have both worlds that I can choose from. But I find that in my case, and I can speak for myself, and I know this is also something that other people that I know of feel as well, not everybody, but some, they feel that the hardware is like an instrument they're playing with. Think of it as like you picking up a guitar. You can play every guitar if you're talented, and you will sound amazing on every guitar because you're talented and you're good at it. But each guitar is going to bring something different from you. And you'll choose to record with a certain guitar because of that sound. Same as you'll choose a certain plugin to work with because of that sound. Hardware is like an animal. It has its own thing. Software as well. The only difference is hardware lives in a different ecosystem, which each part of the ecosystem affects each other. So when you make a tweak on a certain hardware EQ, and that's connected to a console or connected to another compressor or EQ or something else, they interact with each other. And you're pushing into one from the other, you're pulling from one to another, or whatever you want to call it. And the gear has its own sound. Now, plugins that emulate the sound. Are they there exactly? No. Are they good? Yes. Do they have the exact thing? Well, that's a tough question, because it's how do you measure that? Do you measure that by specs, or do you measure it by hearing? Okay. If it's by specs, well, that's a good question, because you'll have to run a ton of measurements beyond the scope of just the simple ones, because there's always more to measure. But if you compare one to another ear by ear and print it and do an ABX test, and you find out that you gravitate to one towards the compared to the other, then whatever will be a plugin or hardware, that one will be the one of your choice. But we have to remember, in analog or digital hardware, it's all an ecosystem, and it's controlled by all the elements. So clocking will affect it. Cabling will affect it. Power will affect it. The way it's chained will affect it. How a piece of gear interacts with the other will affect it. If one is less noisy and the other is more, it will affect the sound. Okay? There's tons of things that are going to affect, and that's why in the hardware domain, a lot of times you really have to find out what works with what. And sometimes you got to change order or move a piece of gear from a different gear because it's affecting the other one, noise and stuff like that. It's more of a trip, okay? It's like owning a zoo, okay? Today, the cows are mooing. Now you got to keep them quiet, and then the others are howling. And, every day when you turn on the gear, you're hoping it's going to stay the same. Sometimes
Isn't that the truth?
It does.
I have a particular cable in the back of my console on one of my vocal channels that, for some reason, channel 2, I always have to tap the thing. I'm in the middle of a print. I'm like, oh, it just lopsided by 2 dB. Reprint, smack the cable. It drives me nuts.
And that's why some people prefer keeping the hardware in the front end only and not in the mixing and not in the mastering. But there's a ton of big mixers who still mix on a mixing board or on a summing box, or they do in the box summing, but they use external inserts either on the mix bus or tracks like channels, or a combination of buses. I personally love hardware gear, and I've been using it for a lot of years. I've had a ton of gear. I still have a ton of gear. I've exchanged a bunch, and every time I have the chance to check something cool, I'll check. I'll see if it works in my setup. And if it makes me work faster, getting better results faster, it's okay if there's any recalls needed or whatever. But I dig it. I love it. And I think that it's a personality thing. I think it's you could be a software guy, you could be a hardware guy, could be a certain time working with that, certain time working with that. There's no rules of it. I'm not going to say software is not good. I'm not going to say hardware is not good, because the best records in the world could be done with both of them. And I think there's a reason why hardware is still in the making. There's a bunch of companies today making gear, from the lower tier to the top tier to boutique and anything in between. There's new stuff that's coming out, which is amazing. There's some stuff that's cloning old stuff. It's a party, man. Like, you got a bunch of it. You just need to listen and see if you like it. And you know what? When I invest in gear, I invest in myself, because it's part of my craft. Okay? So, yeah, I can sit and learn an EQ more and more and more. True. Or compressor or an EQ limiter or whatever. But I can also buy one that I like. So I think that there's still place for hardware. And I think also it's not bad to try out some stuff and figure out if that's your jam, if that's your cup of tea. Because if it makes you get more inspired, go for it. I personally know a few people that once they moved from in the box to out of the box, they jumped quantum leaps in their quality of work. And it doesn't mean that, the opposite can't happen. And I also know people who changed from a external to in the box and they got better results, but that's because some of the gear they were working with was probably less fitting their styling, their sound in general, or just the fact that maybe they had less good gear for those tasks. So, or choices that were not right for to make it work for what they were aiming for.
I have an interesting question that kind of, and then we'll rapid fire some more stuff that are a little bit more technical here. But one thing that I found in my own, we'll call it transition to incorporating some hardware in my own mixing in the last 2 years is, for me, it always heightens the emotional impact of what I'm listening to. I feel more connected to the music. And I had a crazy story. I was once mastering, it was a piano ballad for this girl. And, she's into audio production. So she was like, I sent her the first master I did. And she was like, I think it's a bit too saturated. I love it. And I said, okay. So I did another one. And I'm like, I'm going to send you something to compare it to and just tell me what you think. And I just replicated all the moves I did with the plugin version. And I sent it to her, except, the saturation characteristics sound different. And she's like, I like the first one better. And I'm like, okay, why? And she couldn't put it. And I'm like, I want you to do something. Just forget the technical bullshit. I want you to listen to the song, close your eyes, listen to 1 and 2. I'm not telling you what I did. Tell me which one makes you feel more connected to the song. Because like when I listen to one of these, I feel like I'm sitting there in the room next to you, watching you play piano. Like I can feel your fingers hitting the keys. And when I'm watching the other one, I feel like I'm watching a recording of that, if that makes sense. And like, when I said that to the artist, like it clicked and like, she got it right away. And she was like, oh my God, you're right. Yeah. That was like, there was an emotional, I don't know. There was a depth there that wasn't happening on the second master. And it was one of those moments where, until you articulate it to somebody else, I kind of never really thought about it that way. But it's changed how I view my relationship with equipment and making music, because I feel like sometimes there's an emotional transfer of energy. And at the same time, all we're doing is making speakers go back and forth, which is really mentally taxing to think about, because ones and zeros versus, like, it's the same thing, but there's a difference, and it's observable and it's obvious. And so I don't know, how do you think that those types of tools affect the emotional impact of music?
It's a good point what you're mentioning, because after the Oven plugin came out on Brainworks and Plugin Alliance, I had people asking me.
Great plugin, by the way.
Thank you very much. I had people approaching me asking me, why was this thing made? Like, what was the reason to make? They loved it, but it was interesting for them, like, why such a unit was developed, and as you know, this was and is still, it's a hardware device that is still, being made, built to order. And I have this, and I've been using it for a long time. And the reasoning behind that was exactly how you had described it. I was looking for a tool that I can work with that will help me get that feeling where that emotional impact, the depth, the size, the richness of the music that can be enhanced. And it took a while. It took us a long time to develop such a tool. And once we developed it, it's me and Handy Amps. We both worked on it for years. And this was a collaborative effort in tweaking and ideas, and then taking down what doesn't work, and taking, there's a step of just like refining music, just like you arrange a track, you see what works and what is too much to add. And those are exactly the things that I was looking for, like this element of impact, of emotional connection, where you're enhancing something that technically is there, but now you're bringing it out. When you bring it out, the listener connects to it like he was there. So it's like we're intentionally letting the listener connect to the music by artificially us intruding into that space. Okay. And processing is something that could be intrusive in different directions. Could be bad or good or in between. And think of it this way. The capture is not in our hands. The capture was before us. If you're mixing, you didn't capture it. If you're mastering, you didn't capture it. Okay? When you're mixing, you're taking that capture, and if you have different mics, you're balancing the capture from the different aspects of the mics. If there's other instruments like vocals, you're blending them to feel as one show, balanced to the listener. Now, what I do in mastering, I take that and I kind of give it a surrounding shape, like a
frame,
I'm giving it a frame, right? And in that frame, not only I put the frame, but I shed light. So I can make it darker, I can make it brighter, I can make it more revealing, but that's where you'll hear the inner details, or I can soften it, and then we're like not exposing all the details and making it a bit more, let's call it not murky and foggy, because those are negative terms, but more maybe eerie, or more unclear in a way, or more uncertainty, okay? Or just making it a bit vague, so you'll have to dig deep. What is he saying? What is, like, you can change the aspect of how it's presented in the mastering process, as well as you can do that in the mixing, of course, but they all combine together. But different hardware will apply a sound, and you can make the decision which one works to take it to all those directions. You gave an example of saturation. So saturation could be a negative thing and could be a positive thing. Now, when she noticed it, she noticed the negative effect. But when you took it off, now she understood that there was a positive effect to it, because now she lost what was given that energy. So the first thing the ear was attracted to is, oh, this is not what I was doing. And now you took it off, and now it's like, oh, but now I'm missing something. Yeah, she was missing an element that you had glued to it. You kind of attached to it a layer that by the book is wrong. But you don't read that book. And you go by what's given to the song. And given to the song is that element that made it more fuzzy, wuzzy, whatever you call it, and that excited you and her. And then she accepted it because it brought more excitement to the song, although it was unnatural for her to listen to it that way. In a way, you can say you added, it's like you have a car now, and now you added these LED strips that make lights. And the guy says, oh man, I see too much lights. Then you take them off. It's like, oh, okay, I get it. I like those LED lights. They were actually cool. So sometimes you got to subtract in order for the person to hear what was the cool thing about it.
One thing I think that you do, Maor, is you always give me when I have you master, because I prefer to hire you to master my stuff over anybody else. And I've been through every big name that you can possibly imagine. Maybe there's like 3 or 4 guys out there I haven't been through, but I've had enough first dates to know that I want to stay committed. So you always give me multiple versions of a song. And sometimes the differences are like, I don't want to use the irritatingly subtle, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of A-B to sit down and go through them. But, in there's a certain magic, because as I'm listening through these masters, the first thing I'm like, just pick one. Is it better than what I sent them? Okay. Yes. Okay, great. Now, which version of this do I connect with? Which one does the artist connect with? They might connect with a totally different one than myself and Joe when we listen. But at the same time, every time we land on the same, like we liked version B, or D, but we'll pick B, everybody's always happy with the result, because you always give like a different interpretation of each shade. And like I said, the differences are subtle, and technically you can sit there and be like, okay, this one's wider, this one's more saturated. Okay, that's fine. But at the end of the day, we're selling emotions. So you listen, and you just, the one for me is always like when I'm in my car or something like that, I'm just listening to the song, and I just totally like I stopped listening for the master, and I'm just like, I'm feeling it. So I always enjoyed that. Okay.
Can I elaborate something on that?
Yeah, of course. We have a lot of questions to get through. So
okay, I'll just do a quick one on this. So let's start with this. I'm happy that you like what I do for your mixes. And to me, I want you to hear the master as the song, as 100% the song. Even if what I do will be 5, 10, 20%, whatever, 15%, whatever, or 3%, at the end of the day, it's 100%. I want you to listen to the song. And if it talks to you, if it connects you, if it makes you like it more, then it did its job. Doesn't matter how much percentage it was. At the end of the day, we're looking at 100%, the song. Okay. Now, the reason I give you a few versions is because I know you on a personal level, and I know how you and your assistant like to listen to stuff and go into detail. And when I know my clients on a personal level, I know what to give them. And I know if I give you one version or 2 versions, you might be happy with them. But I also know your nature, that you like digging in and you like figuring out what you like more. So I'll give you an extra and let you make the decision. Some people, I'll just give them 1 because they only can handle 1. Some will get 2, because they like the 2 options. But it's all about communications and connection and understanding who I work with, who's in front of me. Of course, to give you a few versions for an album would be very hard, but sometimes we figure out which is the sound, and then we do the album or whatever. But
literally last week with how to pronounce that band, Voila. We just did a project together last week, and the guy in the band texted me. He's like, Maor just sent me 32 files in a zip. I don't know where to start, but I'll see you in 6 hours. And
well, I gave him
found what he was looking for, though. He was very, very, very happy with it.
Well, the reason I gave those files is also because I gave him different formats. So each master had also MP3s and different WAV files. And so some projects include more files just because the nature of the output of the files, MP3s, different type of WAV files, different resolutions. So it's not like I gave him 36 options.
Yeah, he just like putting it in a text, and I thought it was funny the way he worded it. So, all right. So here's another question for you. How loud do you think metal masters should be these days? I have an opinion on this as a mixer, but let's hear it from you.
I don't think there's a certain volume level that metal mixes should be. I think some metal mixes are loud by the way they're done in the production and the arrangement. Some are loud because they were pushed loud. I don't have a set level of how loud things should really be at. I think you want to get it sound right. It needs to work with the band sound and the production and the mix. Sometimes you need to push it more by request. Sometimes you actually back off. But I wouldn't give a set of numbers because I've done records that are super loud, very loud. They get turned down anyway.
My mixes.
But they get even, turned down anyway. So, I wouldn't give a starting point, but I can suggest this is listen to your genre, listen to what you're actually doing in that metal, okay, because there's so many types, and listen to what it is comparable in terms of aesthetics, okay? Sometimes going lower is not a bad idea. And in some cases, you might want to go higher or stay in between. But overall, remember that there's a win-loss and win and lose game here. And you might win level, might lose dynamics. You might lose level, might win dynamics. And it's a big fine line. And the more that the bands are doing more traditional compared to contemporary, the more you have range to play with. So
I think it also matters what the producer thinks too, because I have people that I mix for. I don't want to name names, and I love them to death. But if I don't send them the loudest thing they've ever heard in their life, every time I send them a mix, they're going to be like, "What's up with the weak master?" Like they want it to destroy. So again, you got to, like you said, you got to know your clients. Okay, here's another one,
and also A&Rs. It's another thing that happens. Sometimes a producer is happy, and mixer and band is happy, but the A&R is pushing it.
Very true. That's a whole nother game. Okay. The next question is, how much headroom should be left in a metal mix for mastering? Normally, if I was going to give advice, I would say somewhere between -6 to -4 peak. So you've got, just take the limiter off. So, you're not giving them something that's pancaked. What do you think? What do you prefer?
It's not bad having headroom. Okay. It's not that I never get mixes that are 0.1 or 0.2 or 0.0 something. My suggestion is try to get your mix sounding as best as possible, clear as possible, and see where in the volume it does that. If it requires you to lower a bit so the mix bus is not congested and it takes 6 dB down, go 6 dB down. If it takes 3 dB down or 4 dB, that's fine as well. The thing about the headroom, a lot of times it has to do with how much you're pushing in your DAW. Because if you're pushing and everything is in the red, it's going to affect the sound. Even if it's not in the red, even if it's yellow, close to some DAWs, or depends on how much tracks you have and it becomes congested. Sometimes going down just releases the space, it just lets it breathe more. So it's a trial and error thing.
I'm sorry, but we have a hard out here in about 7 minutes. So let me keep flying through questions and let's just try to hit them as fast as we can. Okay, choosing the right mixing engineer for a song makes sense, but for a mastering engineer, to me, I have no idea how to. What makes each mastering engineer different?
I think the answer is very simple. Every person has a taste, has a knowledge, and has a discography. And it's best to maybe talk to friends that know people or work with people you trust and ask them, look at people's discography. Someone who might be good at one thing might not be good at the other. Someone who's really good at a lot of stuff might also fit. But it's really about connections and asking and checking out who worked on those records that you like.
Okay, what is the biggest common mistake you notice from inexperienced people trying to master their own mixes?
Too much processing, exaggerated low end and high end, trying to beat something that's out there and just doing more damage than actually benefiting the sound. Trying to push the levels too much where you're not even competing because the mix is not balanced and you're just pushing loudness where it just messes up the whole picture.
Okay. What type of techniques do you use that make your masters different from everybody else?
I don't know because I'm not them. I only know what I'm doing and I don't know if it's unique. I just do what I feel. I move the knobs, I listen, I adjust stuff. And if it sounds good to me, hopefully the client likes it too. So I can't speak for others.
Great answer. How do you become a mastering engineer?
Just like everything in audio, you start with trying out, tweaking a sound and making yourself connected to it as much as possible and practicing and improving and focusing on the craft, and if it's something you want to do, of course.
Right. Okay. Here's a good one. How do you retain punch and clarity in a super loud master? Do you have any tips for the mixers?
First of all, it's mix dependent. Okay. Second thing is you got to watch your low end. Okay. That's the first thing that will get squashed and moved with the limiter. So make sure your low end is tight enough because that's going to sound punchy and it's also going to give room for everything else to penetrate out of the speakers nicely.
Okay. Next question. How can compression be used to make a mix more dynamic, bouncy, and pumpy in the mastering stage?
It's a tough one because compressors do the opposite, but it is possible to create movement with compression. A lot of it is finding that sweet spot where the compression sits on the track and let it breathe and ducks down only certain peaks, which are too much. And that way you'll still get the movement, but the huge peaks will get tamed and balanced with the other one. It's a tricky thing and requires a lot of playing.
Do you ever use any stereo wideners or play with the imaging on your masters?
I have some of the gear that I have has a stereo imaging enhancement by its own. So just putting them in already opens up the stereo field and the depth. So by nature, some of the hardware I have will do that. And then if I need, I also have analog stereo enhancers and wideners. And it's possible to achieve that with different types of gear as well. But when needed, I use it, or by default by the gear itself.
Okay, last question. How would you use the oven plugin in a mastering scenario?
That's an easy one. The first thing is just put it on, bypass on bypass, see what it does in default setting, and if you like the depth, and then play with the headroom knob to make sure you're not hitting it too hard so you can actually process without distorting. And then start moving the knobs. The tone shaping knobs are the first ones that you can play with just to enhance the low end, mid range, or high end, and the sizzle will be the upper range. Then, if you need more coloration, you can add the cook, and then also the temp. But it's very easy to use it. Just make sure you're not hitting it too hard, and if you are, lower the headroom, which means going clockwise, and also you might need to move the flow knob a bit lower.
Well, it's a fantastic plugin. I have it. I highly recommend it. I definitely recommend you go to pluginalliance.com. I believe that's their URL. If it's wrong, I'm sorry, but Google it. Check out a demo of the oven and try it on your own mixes. And, I would say from personal experience, Maor, you've been an absolute weapon for me as a mixing engineer. And you've definitely helped me win some really cool projects and make some great records. And I'm sure we'll do very many more together. So I recommend all of you watching to, if you want to up your mastering game, give Maor a shot sometime. He is phenomenal. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure working with you. You do great work, and we communicate well and connect, and it's a fun process, good collaboration. And thank you again for having me on this show. I hope I answered these questions in a manner that people can relate to them, and keep up the good stuff. And just a message to everybody: it's always going to be a labor of love. It doesn't matter if we get paid for what we're doing. We're doing something that requires a big investment from us on a personal, artistic, and technical level. And the more we're doing it, the more we become better at it.
Well, all right. Thank you so much, everybody. And we will see you soon. Happy mixing.